You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
Hey, it's Sterling K. Brown from the Hulu original series Paradise. The next chapter begins as Xavier's search for his wife takes him above ground, and what he finds will change everything. It was never just about the bunker. Tune in and discover the truth lies outside. Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming, and stream Paradise Season 2 on February 23rd on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 249, Greece Part 1, Plans and Preparations. This week, a big thank you goes out to Ted for the donation, and to Grant, Theodore, and Generalissimos Wallenstein, which is quite the Patreon name. But anyway, thank you all for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Remember, members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The story of the Second World War, after the German attack on France, is a story of the constant expansion of the fighting into new geographical areas and into new countries. We've tracked that expansion so far on this podcast over the last few months, first to North Africa, then to the Balkans and Yugoslavia. And in fact, while the Germans were planning and then executing their invasion of Yugoslavia, there was already a war happening in Greece, with the Italo-Greek War having started with an Italian invasion of Greece during the last months of 1940. For Italy, this would become the primary area of focus for the Italian army, with far greater numbers of men and supplies being sent to Greece than to North Africa, where the Italian army was fighting against the British. At the exact time that Graziani was begging for every tank and every soldier for his efforts in North Africa, 5 full divisions would instead be sent to Albania to prepare for operations in Greece. Mussolini and his advisors simply believed that the efforts against Greece were more important to the future of Italy, with Italian expansion into this region seen as a key war goal that the Italian leaders were keen to secure before any kind of peace should happen. The German leaders initially wanted nothing to do with the fighting in Greece. They were already preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union and believed that focus should be placed on those preparations. However, they would be pulled south, not necessarily by Italian actions, but instead British reactions to those Italian actions. When Greece was attacked by the Italians, even though the Greeks did very well, Churchill and the British leaders would offer assistance, under the belief that fighting the Italians in Greece would be a good way to distract them from North Africa and to protect a Balkan ally that could be a jumping-off point maybe for future operations. In Germany, there were major concerns about British involvement in Greece, primarily due to the ability of British bombers from air bases in Greece to reach the vital German oil supplies from Romania. This threat would cause escalation during the spring of 1941, with both German and British land forces being committed to action in Greece to help the Italians and the Greeks respectively. This series will cover all of those events, both on the Greek mainland and then on the island of Crete. But in some ways, even discussing the British and German involvement in the fighting is doing a disservice to the Italian and Greek armies that would begin the campaign by themselves. And I just want to start with this statement, to reiterate this statement at the front of this series. The start of the invasion in Greece had nothing to do with Germany or Britain. It was entirely an Italian operation. They were pursuing Italian war goals with Italian forces against a Greek enemy. Remembering that fact is key to ensuring that the events of the first period of that invasion do not get overshadowed by what would happen later. That is why we will spend the next 2 episodes focusing just on the period before the Germans became involved in the fighting on the ground. Then, as first the British and then the German forces became involved, the story will broaden, first out into the Mediterranean naval battles, and then also to Crete. In the end, it would be another major setback for all of the countries that were fighting Germany and Italy. But also for the Germans and the Italians, it would be another great victory. It would also be the last time that the Italians and the Germans would defeat another country in a military campaign. There would be other governments replaced, other countries occupied, but not with a traditional military operation like what would be launched against Greece. With all of that said, let's get started by discussing the events in Greece before the start of the war. In 1936, Greece came under the control of a dictatorship led by Metaxas, a Greek military officer and political leader who had been involved with Greek politics for many decades, and also opposed the entry of Greece into the First World War. During the interwar period, he would lead a conservative political group, participating in a few governments until 1935, when he was a key player in getting the former Greek king, George II, put back on the throne through a plebiscite of questionable legitimacy. Metaxas was then allowed to establish a government, even though his political party was one of the smaller ones after the 1936 elections, mostly due to the support of the king, and he would remain in power until his death in 1941. Regardless of the political situation, relations with Britain remained strong, which would be important during the war years, and in fact Metaxas was a strong supporter for some kind of alliance with Britain in the late 1930s. During most of that period, the British leaders were not inclined towards such alliances, preferring the appeasement approach that would kind of reach its zenith at Munich. Metaxas was concerned about future military actions, though, and this prompted major investment into the Greek military starting in 1936. The challenging part was that Greece's industrial base could not really support the creation of some of the more advanced types of military equipment seen at this time. This meant that most weapons had to be purchased abroad, which was difficult for the Greek treasury to handle, particularly at a time when Greece was already having issues with its economy due to changes in international trade. However, the efforts did continue, and they would eventually allow the military to build up to 5 army corps, containing 15 infantry and 1 cavalry division, plus some regiments of support units. That brought the total up to somewhere around 250,000 men. Then, when the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, Greece would officially announce its neutrality as quickly as possible. However, the expectation was that this would probably just delay Greek entry, not prevent it, especially once things spooled out into France and Italy joined in the fighting. After the fighting had started in Poland and then sort of escalated from there, the relationship between Greece and Britain would be an important part of everything that Greece did during the Second World War. However, there were differences to what had happened a generation earlier, when the Greeks and the British had also worked together during the First World War. Because, of course, during the First World War, Britain and France had appeared to be quite strong when they requested Greece to join them, and start a second front in the Balkans. In 1940, the British were in a very, very different situation, and France wasn't even in the war anymore. This did not prevent the Greeks from reaching out to the British, but it did really change that relationship. They were reaching out more out of almost desperation than anything else. After the Italian invasion of Albania in the spring of 1939, the first official guarantees were given to Greece by the British, but they were quite vague about exactly what the British promised the Greeks in case of an Italian invasion. Part of the reason for this was the fact that the British leaders simply did not know what they would have available at any given moment if the Italians actually invaded. Before the start of the war, there were barely enough British forces in the Mediterranean theater to defend British interests there, let alone enough to send to Greece, and it would be difficult to justify draining British strength from other areas, as the fighting increased seemingly all over Europe. This entire situation, of course, only got worse after the Italians entered the war, and then after the fall of France, when British strength was stretched thinner than ever before. The British Army was still fighting in the deserts of North Africa, and the Royal Navy was still the Royal Navy. But other than those two facts, the war had went quite well for Italy and Germany. This put the Greeks in an odd position where they wanted and needed British help, but the British were not necessarily in a good position to give it, even if Churchill believed that it was necessary. But of course, Greece was seeking a defensive alliance at this point, and so they were not the instigator of the events in the region. That would instead be Italy. Mussolini wanted to make sure that in the last part of 1940, the Italian army was doing something to control more territory somewhere. The primary area of attack was originally in North Africa against the British and Egypt. However, when the initial Italian attacks were delayed by several months, and then only reached Sidi Barrani, barely across the Egyptian border, Mussolini began to look closer to home for the next campaign of conquest. Having already invaded and taken control of Albania, the plan was to use it to stage an invasion of Greece, although Yugoslavia was briefly considered as a target as well. It was eventually rejected because of the economic relationships between Germany and Yugoslavia that we talked about a few episodes ago. It eventually meant that Hitler was not going to let Italy mess with Yugoslavia in any way. And so Greece became the target. And after the disappointing delays in Egypt, more divisions and troops would be sent to Albania to prepare for that Greek campaign. While the Greek adventure would not cause any economic issues for Germany, it was still generally against the advice of Germany, with Hitler and the other German leaders believing that any war in the Balkans presented risks for the upcoming Barbarossa offensive. But this did not necessarily deter Mussolini and his military leaders. They did not need German permission to do whatever they wanted to do in the Balkans. Sure, they would ignore Yugoslavia because Greece was still a good target, but they weren't going to get talked out of this thing. The original date for the attack was to be the first week of September 1940, but as the date neared, it was pushed back to October. A key to all the planning and preparations was the general belief among the Italian leaders that the Greeks would not actually fight them, and in fact the Greek forces were more likely to refuse to fight, and they would turn against their officers and join the Italians. However, during early October, in the direct run-up to the attack, some of these delusions were at least chipped away at due to the stiffening of Greek resolve, as evidenced by the political discussions that were happening during this time. There was also the ever-present problem that any attack into Greece would simply be easier if the Italians first attacked into Yugoslavia, because controlling southern Yugoslavia would almost double the frontage on which the Italians could attack. But Hitler was very clear that Yugoslavia was protected by its pro-German monarch, Prince Paul, and that it should not be touched. But the Italians would make a plan to work around these restrictions, but the delays kept piling up as they continued to try and get ready. And then a meeting would be held on October 15th, which would be particularly important to the future of Italy. On that day, a council of war was held to specifically discuss the possibility of an attack on Greece. Mussolini had decided that an attack had to happen at the earliest possible moment, and this opinion was mostly prompted by the decision made in Germany to expand its control in Romania in the previous weeks, and to place Luftwaffe troops in place to protect the vital Plostoy oil fields in Romania from any kind of British attack. The Romanian fields provided crucial supplies of oil to the German war machine and had to be protected at all costs in the minds of the German leaders. But this German move rankled Mussolini because he had not been consulted, even though Italy's interests clearly placed the entire Balkan area within the Italian sphere of influence. Here's the Germans just mucking around. And so Mussolini was going to do something bold and rash without consulting the Germans. In fact, he wanted the Italian army to act fast enough that Hitler could not even voice a word of concern. The foreign minister, Ciano, promised to work on some kind of border incident that would be used to justify an invasion. And on the military side, Viscount Praska, the commander of the forces in Albania, believed that the forces under his command could reach Athens, in a week. That's not really a problem. While Ciano thought the Greeks would surrender the instant bombs were dropped on their capital. There were some in attendance who were less convinced about the upcoming Italian operation, but none of them could speak out openly against it, with Mussolini making it clear that this was not the time for dissenting voices, it was the time for action.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me. The show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
To execute their attack, the Italians had 9 divisions positioned within Albania, and these forces would be split into 3 different groups for the attack. Along the coast, the coastal group would advance, down the coast. In the middle, a little over 2 divisions worth of troops would advance to the south, while in the east, another division would advance through the mountainous terrain in that area. I won't really bother talking too much more in detail about the Italian plans, other than to say it had very lofty goals, and none of which would be reached. This meant that about 87,000 men would be advancing along a front of around 250 kilometers in width. Most of it was quite mountainous as well, or at least difficult to move across. There were paths that they could take that were not challenging, generally through a series of valleys and other sort of non-obstacle strewn areas, but the Greeks were well aware of the terrain in this area and knew that these would be the most likely avenues for an attack. And to man these positions, the Greeks would have about 50,000 men of the second corps of their army, with the terrain playing a huge part in sort of reducing the challenges that were often experienced by an outnumbered army. The Italians also knew that the Greeks knew where they would be attacking from, but their plan was based on 2 very poor assumptions. The first assumption I've already mentioned. They simply believed that the Greek army would not fight, and if it did, it would be ineffective and quick to give up ground. Based on this assumption, the idea was that the entire plan for the attack did not have to be perfect, it just had to happen, and the Italians would be victorious. The second assumption was that the Italian forces that would launch the attack were ready for the kind of fighting that they would face, and were prepared to launch an attack at the scale that was being asked of them. There were 87,000 Italian soldiers available for the attack, and numbers do matter, but their units were not in a good position to attack. There was a serious lack of artillery support units like hospital units, and the armor units that were available were not in great shape. For example, at the center of the thrust in the center of the line, there were about 150 light Fiat tanks, but many of them were barely running. These issues made the paper strength of the Italian forces, 9 divisions, a bit of a lie, and that was not properly taken into account by the Italian leaders. The good news, I guess, on the Italian side, is that Ciano was able to deliver on his promise of diplomatic events that could at least start to justify an Italian invasion. The events that were fabricated would occur in southern Albania. The first was a series of leaflets dropped by an airplane over Albania, which told the Albanians to join the Greeks to fight the Italians. The aircraft was, of course, an Italian aircraft. The second event were some bombs that exploded near some official Italian buildings in an Albanian city. The bombs were, of course, planted by the Italians. Finally, there was also an announcement that a group of Greek soldiers had attacked Italian positions near the border. This attack did not occur. And so, with the obvious and completely fabricated provocations out of the way, the Italian leaders moved on to the next phase of their plan, the ultimatum. In the grand tradition of ultimatums, the one that the Italians would send to the Greeks was designed to be rejected. It would be delivered to Metaxas at 3 a.m. on October 28th, and it began by stating that the Greeks had violated their declared neutrality due to their relations with the British, claiming that the Greeks had allowed Royal Navy vessels to stay in port too long and to use Greek facilities to resupply, which was not really allowed for neutral nations. They couldn't allow warships to resupply sort of in their ports. The core of the ultimatum was the demand made by the Italians, which stated that as a guarantee of neutrality by Greece and for the security of Italy, they wanted to occupy various facilities within Greece with its armed forces and for the duration of the conflict with Britain. Just some strategic points in Greek territory. As with many such ultimatums, this clause was designed to cause it to be rejected. because allowing the military forces of Italy to enter into their country and occupy various strategic locations was essentially just surrendering for the Greeks. That's kind of what it came down to. As the story goes, after Metaxas finished reading the note that had been given to him, he would reply back that the Greek government rejected the terms and that, quote, "well then, it's war." After this rejection, there were a few hours to go before the Italian forces would attack, with the ultimatum not set to expire until 6 a.m. Metaxas and the other Greek leaders would not simply wait around for those next few hours, though. Metaxas' first call was to the king, of course, and then ministers started to be informed that they had to get to an emergency cabinet meeting as quickly as possible. While they were assembling, Metaxas would head directly to the British ambassador to ensure that the British leaders were notified as quickly as possible also about what was happening. He would also send a personal message to Churchill, quote, "The war we confront today is thus solely a war for honor. The outcome of the world war will not be decided in the Balkans," end quote. In the message, he also made it clear that the Greeks would fight regardless of what the British did, but any help that they could provide would be invaluable, not just for a military perspective, but also to help boost Greek morale. After his trip to the British ambassador, Metaxas would meet with the king and crown prince before the cabinet meeting started at 5:30 a.m. During the meeting, they would sign the general mobilization order, and they would be as prepared as possible for the war that they'd only found out about, 2 hours before. As news spread around Greece about what was happening, their response from citizens everywhere was quite rapid. Among the reservists who would be called up by the mobilization order, many times they did not even wait for the notices to arrive, and instead they would just begin reporting to their assigned muster points. Obviously, the Italians had been very wrong about the willingness of the Greeks to fight. The second interesting thing that happened is that almost overnight, all of the political divisions in Greece would be healed, essentially immediately. And while the day before there were Greek political leaders that spoke strongly against the Metaxas dictatorship, as soon as the Italians were on the doorstep, those differences were forgotten. There were even some opposition leaders who had literally been put in jail for speaking out against the dictatorship, who would request that they be released from prison so that they could join the war effort. Looking into the future for Greece, these feelings of unities would not remain during the certainly late and post-war period, but for a few months of 1940 and 1941, the Italians had done what no Greek politician had been able to do for a very long time: unite Greece behind a single purpose. While all of Greece was uniting against the possibility of an Italian invasion, at the front, when the attack began at 5:30 a.m., that attack did not go as well as the Italian leaders had hoped. The first problem was that the days before October 28th had been filled with rain along much of the attack front, which in many places meant that instead of nice, dusty mountain paths, they were a muddy quagmire. But at least at the very start of the attack, things went well in some places, because the Greek forces, commanded by General Papagos, had been planning to retreat back from the border to more defensible positions, sort of to their rear. This meant that throughout the first day of the attack, there was actually not a ton of actual fighting, as the Greek forces retreated and the Italians moved forward. Every day that the Greeks could delay, though, was critical, because immediately when the Italian attack started, Papagos had started transferring troops from the Bulgarian border to bolster his forces that were facing the Italians. Unfortunately for those Italians, bad weather continued on the second day of the attack, with the added issue that the rain was so heavy that it was causing all of the waterways in the region to become swollen, making crossing them often quite difficult. The weather system as a whole was broad enough that it would impact the shipment of supplies from Italy. That's how much of a problem it was. At the front, it would not be until November 2nd, 4 days after the start of the invasion, that the first major encounter would occur between Greek and Italian troops, about 30 kilometers inside of Greek territory at Kalpaki. Kalpaki was in a valley along a major road, and it was important territory, and the local Greek commander knew it. And so over the previous days, the Greek units of the 8th Division had been digging defenses in preparation for the Italian attack. The presence of Greek forces at Kalpaki was not a surprise to the Italians, and so the Italians would attempt to soften them up, first in a series of air attacks, which would begin around 9 o'clock in the morning on November 2nd. Then, a few hours later, the Italian artillery would be in position to join in the bombardment. Then finally, late in the afternoon at 4 p.m., the Italian tanks began their attack, with 50 of the Italian light tanks moved into position, and then they started moving forward. The results were less than impressive, because almost immediately when they came within range of the Greek artillery, that artillery began disabling Italian tanks. To quote a radio transmission from one of the Italian officers, quote, "I'm being hit on all sides by heavy enemy small and medium caliber artillery fire. This artillery fire is devastatingly accurate," end quote. Obviously, he said that in Italian, translating it there. Even the tanks that did reach the first Greek positions were at times disabled by things as simple as blankets being bound up in their tracks. That was sometimes a great anti-tank weapon. Just some blankets in the tracks, bind them up, and it can't move. Over the next several days, the Italians would continue their attacks, with very little gained except for more casualties. Then, on the 8th of November, the Italians would pull back from their attack at Kalpaki, and also the entire Italian offensive would be halted. While it could be easy to blame the weather for the failure of the initial Italian attacks, and the weather certainly hampered operations, it was far from the only reason that the attack stalled so quickly after it crossed the Greek border. At the simplest level, the Italian attack was simply not well organized or well planned. It was not designed in expectation of strong resistance, and the Italian forces were spread too thin and had too little air and artillery support to have any real hope of breaking the Greek line. The best example of this was the fact that there was not a telephone line that connected the primary Italian Army and Air Force command posts, which meant that all discussions of air support had to be carried between the two by an officer in a small aircraft. Not exactly high-tech. Once the initial attacks had stalled, and that information made its way back to Rome, orders were sent out to massively reorganize the entire army. These orders apparently originated with Mussolini himself, with the goal of taking the divisions that were in place and forming them into 4 corps, which would then be used for further attacks. There was also a new representative of the Italian General Staff that was sent to Greece to oversee the reorganization, General Sodu. He was the deputy chief of the General Staff and the Under-Secretary of War, so he certainly was well informed of the events that had occurred. Sodu would then be put in command of the entire operation, replacing General Praska, who would be retired from active service a couple weeks later. This meant that Sodu would be in command of the next phase of the operation, which will be covered next episode. But I don't think it would surprise any listener of this podcast to learn that when an offensive starts, achieves nothing, the commander is replaced, and the entire order of battle is put into a blender, well, it's not a recipe for success.